Hello, 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 and welcome to our newest pop culture therapy session. I'm Cruellica Kain.
Hello, it's me, Advent Nebula, and this is going to be our beginning of spooky season.
Yay, Halloween month! Even though, for me, Halloween is here.
Well, we're horror movie junkies, so...
I know! Anytime, even kaiju's like this, it's like, hey, now we can watch horror movies. I've watched about 75 horror movies at least already. What do you mean, now?
Well, look at it this way. Now you can just watch more with him.
I know!
Except he's going to be on his trails from the Crypt binge again.
Well, he said he's going to now this year mix up Tales from the Crypt with OG Twilight Zone.
We need to get him on Outer Limits.
Well, that Quantum Leap. Yeah. There's many. But yeah, no, he's now added a new series to it. So whenever he's not doing review related stuff or anything else, he just watches Tales from the Crypt and now Twilight Zone. Yay.
So, like we promised last time, to begin spooky season, we're going to be putting little Mr. Freddy Krueger in our therapy chair.
I know! So, Freddy Krueger, who I've always enjoyed, is the titular character of Nightmare on Elm Street, which came out in 1984. Not to say my parents were irresponsible by any means. My uncle was, and we'll get into that later day with Child's Play. But, I still found a way at the age of 5, this is saying how old I am, to watch it a year after it came out. And like many horror movies, the initial reaction of a young child watching a horror movie is to immediately fear everything in the known universe. I think I refused to go to sleep without, like, total exhaustion taking me out for probably about 2 months.
Smart!
Yeah, no, my parents love that. They're like, you watched, and when they found out it was Nightmare on Elm Street, my God, yeah. No, there was no amount of, like, angry words said at the babysitters. But still, it was one of the first horror movies I watched, and Freddy Krueger for me has always been that character that whenever I think of horror, I automatically go to him.
Michael Myers may have been the one that truly started the slasher craze, but if you want to think about uniqueness that we've really got, especially with the latter incarnations of Jason, what they did with Ghostface, with the flipping Wes Craven when he came out with his new slasher icon, you gotta attribute Freddy for a lot of the uniqueness there is. But his character is one of the more messed up, but at the same time, you can kind of look at a man that was done wrong.
Well, he is an incredibly iconic character, and when you think of all the icons that we have for horror, most people think of Freddy Krueger, even if they haven't seen the movies, and this is really because of the writing.
And Robert Englund just stole the performance.
He did, because as I was talking to Kaiju about this before, even the crappy Nightmare on Elm Street movies in the core franchise, they still were... Freddy's part was still fantabulous.
Yes. As bad as 2 and 5 are, they're still enjoyable just because of Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger.
Absolutely. And it also proves that not everyone can pull off a Freddy Krueger, because if you look at the remake...
Jackie Eddie Hurley looked the part, he didn't pull off the part.
No, and I understand that's also based on the script, but in my philosophy is the actor also has to put themselves into the role. It's not simply just a script. Because incredibly done movies can have terrible scripts. It's just based on how the people portray it. So, a brief breakdown of why Nightmare on Elm Street came to be, because I think this is what really helps to identify why he was written as such.
Yeah.
So Wes Craven had two inspirations from this. One was there, obviously during the time where he wrote this, the late 70s, early 80s, there were a lot of child killers. And these are not primarily molesters. They're two different factors, not that any of it's good, so please forgive me, I'm not trying to say one's right over the other. But there were a number of serial killers out there that had killed children. Not for sexual gratification, just...
They were an easy target for this serial killer.
They were horrible, horrible people. The other thing is, as a child, Wes Craven was incredibly scared by a man he saw out the window in the middle of the night wearing a fedora and a striped sweater. And when he was looking at creating a horror movie for New Line at that time, he came up with these two things of, well, slasher is now popular because Halloween really pushed it forward, and we had Texas Chainsaw and we had Friday the 13th. So obviously slashers were the way to go at the point.
And this is probably what you would say is the first truly big budget, because this had a relatively large budget for a slasher film in the 80s.
It did, and it actually made back its budget. Because it was a very simplistic premise of kids being killed, but they're not awake. They're not being attacked by a physical entity. They always die horrifically in their sleep.
And they're the kids of the parents that turned on Freddy.
So Freddy Krueger as a character, you learn this in Freddy 4, or Nightmare on Elm Street 4, is that he is the son of a nun and 99 convicts. I think you can kind of get the gist of why his mother had a baby, because being the religious sort, even though it was a terrible, terrible act that had her begotten with a child, she had a child. She then dies not long after birth. So obviously Freddy Krueger then is raised outside of that. He, if you see from Freddy 6, he has a normal life, has a wife, has a child. However, he becomes a child killer. And they don't go into detail of exactly what that means, why he did it, what his ramifications were, anything like that. But he was on the fringes of society already, because at least from his work, he was more of a handyman type of person. And that's the extent of what we really know about him as his backstory.
And we know a little bit more from New Nightmare that he ended up working alongside children at times as well.
Correct, yes, because he was almost like a janitor type thing as well. That's why you see a lot of the boilers in a lot of the movies, is where he kind of tends to haunt. So he then starts killing children. Once again, terrible, terrible human being. Nobody's ever going to deny any of these slasher villains are good people that did wrong. However, justice, admittedly, was on his side. There was no proof. There was no way to verify he did any of the crimes that he was accused of. And admittedly, in all of the movies, while we've heard that he was a child murderer, we actually have never seen any proof.
Yeah, there's never been any proof there. And it's all been him exacting the revenge on what happens next to him.
So what happens next to him is that he's basically lynched by all the parents of the community and taken to a warehouse in the outskirts of town in the boiler rooms. He runs into there because he's running away from everyone. They lock him in the building and throw gasoline through the windows and set it on fire. So he is essentially burns to death. And as he's burning to death, he vows revenge on everyone who has killed them through their children. Because his way of saying it, at least in the first movie, is that he is completely innocent. That he was wrongfully accused.
And he'll end up taking out the revenge by taking what was most precious to them in the most horrifying way possible. But we don't know for another generation what he meant by that.
Absolutely. So that's the basic story. Once again, as we say in everything in this world, all of it's alleged. Obviously, we've seen the movies, so we know story-wise.
Fast forward 15 years later.
Absolutely. And 15 years later, we start having random high school students. I don't know why high school was chosen. I think it's because the common age group of the slasher genre was usually about junior to senior high school or early college. Just because I think it's that young and vibrant.
And this is where we get a lot of the tropes that we have with the slasher flick here.
Absolutely. So we first start in because two friends are hanging out having a girls' night together. Nancy and I think it's Jamie. So they're together and they are hanging out for a girls' night because her friend is very, very scared. And she is getting basically, effectively, in her opinion, haunted, but she doesn't know what. Everything in her dreams are scaring her. Oh, Tina. That's her name, Tina. So, yeah, Jamie is from 3. But Tina is basically from kind of a broken home. Her mom is less than stellar as a human being.
Well, her mother likes the bottle a little too much.
That's Nancy's mom.
Yeah.
Actually, I think all the moms like it.
Yeah, I think
But Tina's mom is not the greatest. Basically, her and her boyfriend of the month decide last minute to go to Vegas for the weekend. Why not? We're going to leave our underage child alone in the house when she's already explained that she's having nightmares, she's having issues.
It's like, oh, she's 16, she'll get over it.
Yeah, it's fine, it's fine. But then again, I have to admit, this is the 80s. That was very common. If you've ever heard the term latchkey, basically the 80s to the early 90s, and both of us could effectively raise our hands because we were latchkey kids, that was a very common trope. You didn't worry about your kids just disappearing, and sadly, this day and age is much, much different, but then you didn't even lock your house half the time. It was there. If somebody walked in and stole it, then whatever. So Tina brings Nancy over. Nancy then has her boyfriend come over, who is played by the young
Johnny Depp.
Yes. So we have him playing Glenn, and Johnny Depp is by no means Johnny Depp. He is nerdy, not overly nerdy, but he's kind of not as cool as Johnny Depp eventually becomes.
It's pre-21 Jump Street Johnny Depp.
Absolutely. This is actually his very first role. And so they come over, then Tina's boyfriend comes over. We're not going to get into everything, but essentially the reason why I highlight this is because this is the first big kill that we see of Freddy's. And this is really how we get to see the experience of how his character trope is going to be. Tina and Rod are both sleeping. Tina then knocks at the door, knocks at the window from Rox, wakes up, and then travels through the house. It looks very, very real. But it's a dream. And it's fascinating because when you first see Freddy, you see him from the background. You actually don't see him fully.
You see snippets of the fedora. You see snippets of the sweater. You see snippets of shadow versions of Freddy as this whole sequence is going on.
And he's very frightening, very scary. And then he comes in and he starts with a little bit of humor where he cuts off half of his hand as a joke just to watch the ooze gushing out. And as you go along through this scare, you then see two different scenes. When you get to her in the bed being killed by Freddy, he is on top of her, slashing at her with his claws, which I actually have a set of these. In the real world, though, she is just tossing and turning around.
And then you're seeing all of a sudden all these marks of cuts from a blade appearing on her body just at random, and she's screaming.
And nobody knows why. And in truth, another thing that Wes Craven was looking at when creating Freddy is there have actually been stories about people who have physically received wounds and other harmful factors in their dreams that nobody knows how they came in. There's actually a study about it because people don't know how they are harmed when all they did was sleep. And so it's that fear of you're asleep. You should be safe. There's nothing, as you're always told, there's nothing in your dreams that can harm you. And this is where Freddy really comes in as a therapy chair recipient of our time. Because he has the humor. Throughout the entire movie, he doesn't just haunt and scare.
He toys and ends up making a game out of everything.
He really does. He's the perfect example of turning life into gamification. If he can have fun with it, he'll have fun with it. Like he turns a phone into a mouth and says, "I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy." Just having fun with it. He then brings his claws out of the water like Jaws would without the music, like he's going to be swimming around like a fish to pull somebody into the water when they're taking a bath.
Or in New Nightmare, when he ends up turning one of the kids into a stick puppet.
Oh, yes. And then you also have in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 where he does a D&D type joke campaign with one of the characters who's in a wheelchair who plays D&D all the time. Or he also in 5, which I know is not the greatest, but was it 5? Yes, with the comic book.
Yes.
Where he actually throws the kid into a comic book dream and turns everything into a comic.
And then the meta humor of 7, when he actually is it's Robert Englund in the director's chair confronting Freddy Krueger, which is one of the most meta scenes you'll ever see.
Absolutely. And then we also have the other element that I really appreciate about Freddy Krueger, and this is his ability to manipulate his victims. It's not simply just scaring them. It's not simply just having fun.
He's guiding them to what he wants to do.
Absolutely. The first movie is a great example because he basically, in that movie, convinces Nancy in certain ways to bring him to the real world so he can get revenge on her mother. And then in Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which, yes, it's not the greatest movie, and we could actually do a whole review on the allegories for homosexuality and coming out, because that's actually what the director planned. That movie is where Freddy actually is reborn from the main kid. He takes control of the kid because he moved into Freddy's home, or Nancy's home, and actually turns him into almost a newer version of Freddy. And then you have where he takes advantage of people in their dreams to kill other people.
New Nightmare with the ability to have the kid walking up the clock tower so he can end up hanging him from the bell tower.
Oh, that's actually not New Nightmare.
Oh, that's Dream Warriors.
Yeah, Dream Warriors. But he does that, and then in Freddy's Dead, which is the last of the main core before you get to Wes Craven's New Nightmare, he actually convinces the last kid on Elm Street to basically run away and find a way to convince new kids to come in. So his manipulation is everywhere.
And he knows what he's doing. His charisma is off the charts.
And his ego. Because by the time you get to Freddy's Dead, He has killed every single child in the town. Every single child that was the child of one of those parents that he needed to get revenge on, he killed. And then he just continued because his ego took it to the next degree. He killed every other kid he could until either all the families moved away or every kid was dead. And then with the last kid available, that's how he expanded to collect new souls.
And his ego got so bad, he actually had to end up taking on kids from another horror franchise.
Yes. So this is actually one of my favorite of the franchise, even though technically it's a Friday the 13th movie. But Jason versus Freddy or Freddy versus Jason, go either way, where Freddy manipulates Jason to, instead of going to Camp Crystal Lake, to go to his hometown and start murdering kids. Unfortunately, this is where I really see his ego get the best of him, because where Nancy, who has been his primary foe in first one, third one, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare, get the best of him, it's now another horror icon who takes control of everything. And every time Freddy goes in for the kill, Jason's there 2 seconds ahead of him. But Freddy is iconic because of the comedy with the horror. Because that was a rarity at that point in time. While there were comedy horror-esque films, it wasn't a commonplace feature.
Yeah, this was it was a slasher flick before it was a comedy feature, because it was using the comedy to highlight just how horrifying Freddy is as a person.
And I feel like that was something that really Robert Englund brought to the table. Because if you've seen any of his other horror movies, because he really is one of those big stars of horror.
Yeah, because he had done this is probably one of the cheesiest sci-fi horror movies out there, The Lost Galaxy, where he's a ship commander, and it's a horrible movie, but you can't help but watch because of the body horror. But Robert Englund has this comedic effect at the same time.
Well, think about Zombie Strippers.
Yeah.
Where he plays the zombie owner. He is so crude, so crass, but he just does everything so well. Because he was even in the first Urban Legend. And he did such a great job there, too. And so Robert Englund, he's said so many times he will continue playing Freddy until he can never play Freddy any longer. That is one of the reasons why I think everyone also likes it, is because you have an actor who is so motivated. Kind of like Kain Hodder with Jason Voorhees. He's willing to continue doing the Jason Voorhees stuff because he appreciates it so much.
And Kain Hodder is basically like, please, get this out of legal limbo.
Which hopefully soon. But nevertheless, the other elements that I really want to focus on here with is not just his movie franchise. He's also been in rap videos. Not the greatest rap videos, but still. He also had a long-running television series. He basically was kind of like the host, like Rod Serling in a way, but it was called Freddy's Nightmares. And it ran for a couple of seasons, and it was basically short-form horror movies, similar to Tales from the Crypt, but a little bit different. Because where Tales from the Crypt was more HBO focused, this was more, I would say, general audience focused.
Yeah, because this ran on MTV, so...
Yeah, it was still very horrific and very violent.
And this is when MTV was experimenting with a lot of its stuff, too.
Absolutely. And so there was a lot of opportunity to see Freddy take on different personas. Freddy has also been the inspiration for a lot, because where... as we started with the beginning, we had slasher, but we really didn't have supernatural slasher that was so popular. And Freddy, in Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger was able to move that forward where we could get other supernatural-esque slasher movies.
Yeah. Clive Barker, when he was writing the short stories that became Hellraiser, he actually was inspired by what they did with Freddy Krueger.
And if you think about it, while there's no actual literal connotation, one thing that kind of helped is Child's Play, if you think about it, with the fact that it's a supernatural-esque slasher film. Obviously, Child's Play is iconic in its own right because Chucky, or Charles Lee Ray, is an incredible character. But having something so different, I think, really said we don't have to follow the same formula. It doesn't necessarily have to be kids in a campground or kids in a house. Obviously, they're all in a house, but with Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger as what he does, every kill could be so elaborate and so different. You don't see the same kill twice, which is where I think a lot of other horror movies that really did it, like Saw and so many others, there was so much more theatrics to it than just knife in body, body go there.
Yeah, it truly was. One of those. Saw ended up making it the torture genre go in a different place, kind of like how Freddy made the slasher genre go in a completely different place.
And Freddy Krueger is basically, I would say, the passion project of both Robert Englund, who portrayed him, and Wes Craven. Well, Wes Craven did not direct any of the other core movies outside of Wes Craven's New Nightmare. He was around for them, and he still obviously touted and respected them for all that they did with his original creation.
Yeah, he was a producer for most of them until when he decided to come back to do New Nightmare.
Yeah, he wasn't involved in 2, which obviously, if you've ever seen Nightmare on Elm Street 2, is very apparent.
And he was working on another film at the time, like 5 was going on, and it's very apparent.
Oh yeah, you can definitely see when he's not around for any of them. But if you've not seen Nightmare on Elm Street, I personally say check it out. It is a great movie, and Kaiji Okami did a full review of the entirety of the movie. And it's well worth a watch. Even if you're not a huge horror fan, I think of it as just a valuable piece of pop culture cinema to check out to understand where many of the references come from, as well as the icon itself.
Yeah, and it inspired Wes Craven later on to create Scream, which flips the entire horror genre on its head.
Yes, because yes, it's a slasher genre, and it's actually one of the last technical slasher genre movies. But without Scream, we wouldn't have so many of our other movies that have come out. So Wes Craven, in and of itself, he is an icon that has created not only one of my favorite horror movie characters, but so many other horror movie characters, and has inspired others to take that leap into a genre that people don't think can be spectacular or high-powered or money-making.
Yeah, and the thing, Wes Craven's final entries on both Nightmare on Elm Street with New Nightmare and then Scream with Scream 4, and Scream 4 being the very last movie he did, both being very meta films.
Absolutely. They both, all of the, especially the first and the last Nightmare on Elm Street, or New Nightmare for Wes Craven, and the Scream movies really did social commentary. They talked about family dynamics. They talked about being in broken homes or being in difficult homes, or challenge or managing something that's completely out of your control. Because you can always look at the nightmare aspect as an allegory for how do you handle adulthood.
Yeah. And he also looks at it as what does the price of fame do to somebody, especially when it's in a tragic circumstance.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but overall, I hope you enjoyed our therapy chair session of Freddy Krueger. I was about to say Freddie Mercury because apparently I now want to listen to Queen. But join us for some of our other horror podcasts because once again, it's October. We have to take advantage.
Yes, happy October 1st, everybody.
Bye, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, we will see you soon.